Well, good morning, everybody. I appreciate those that are here. Appreciate via Zoom or in person. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order for Governmental Affairs to talk with the folks from NCSL. Miss Wendy Underhill is with us this morning, and she's put together a very comprehensive presentation. I know she's going to do a great job. I had the opportunity to talk to her and visit with her, and knows her stuff. So give us some good things to consider that are best practices from across the country. Our intent as we wrap up this investigative process is to wrap up in a couple of weeks. We are still working on a date with the Secretary of State's office so that we can kind of revisit with them and finalize and find out what's actually in the works and what's going on so that we know what's already in place. I would just give you a heads up. The idea is for us, talk to some of you, but the idea is for us to have a list of 2025, whatever we come up with, allow the committee to rank those 1 through 5 in the order of what they see their importance would be. And then we'll deliver that along with any other findings to the Speaker's office. So if you have an idea or you have a recommendation, forward it on and we'll include it in that list that goes out to everybody. We can get those kind of ranked and voted on and move forward. Does anybody have anything before we get started? Any members? Leader Trammell has asked, I guess via text, what the timeline is for the list. As soon as I find out when the Secretary of State's office is going to meet, we'll probably try to have our list together within about 48 hours after that meeting is over. So if you can go ahead and be working on whatever it is you've got or you may want to suggest and get it to us, we'll start compiling those and we'll try to get them out as soon as we get through with that particular meeting. That answer your question, Leader Trammell? Yeah. Thank you. Well, Ms. Underhill, I apologize. I don't have a resume here in front of me. I probably should, but I think many of us know your organization well and know who you are, and we really appreciate you spending the time. I know you're a couple hours west on the time scale, so you got up a little bit early to prepare and get ready for us, but I'm going to turn the meeting over to you. Once again, thank you so much for being with us, and let's see if I can get this.
Okay. I think I'm ready. And I appreciate very much that you invited me to be here with you today, even though I'm not there in person with you. And my resume, and if we ever want to talk about it, we can, but basically I've been working on elections policy for 10 years at the National Conference of State Legislatures. So I am Wendy Underhill. My title is Director of Elections and Redistricting at NCSL. And for any of you who don't know, NCSL is the nation's bipartisan organization that supports the work of legislators and legislative staff throughout the nation. And while our structure is bipartisan, the work that we do, we think of as nonpartisan, which is to say we offer information and analysis, and we do not offer opinions on any legislation or policy options that come before legislators. That's your job, not ours. In terms of our bread and butter work, that is responding to requests that come in from legislators or legislative staff. And so if anyone on the committee or any staff who are listening have questions on elections, you can certainly send them to me at any point. We do handle these confidentially. If you have questions on other topics, you can still send them to me and I will farm them out to the right person. In terms of election policy, it seems as though this year there's only one issue of interest, and that is how to run good elections in a time of COVID. And that's indeed my topic for today. And based on the invitation I got through Molly Aziz, I will specifically focus on the primary season and what we've learned from it going into the November elections. And if you'll give me just a moment, I'll share my screen with you and we'll hope that this goes smoothly. Let's try this one. I think it's this one. Do you see my screen now? Okay. Just a second, I'm gonna move my slides. There we go. My top line message is that the coronavirus has presented a challenge to all states in regard to election administration. And all states have been working to find a way to allow everyone who is eligible to vote to do so in a safe manner, while also assuring that the process is accurate and secure. And I'm sorry to say that there is no one best practice on that. In fact, we're having trouble coming up with even a good menu of ideas. And I could hear from your opening comments, Chairman Blackman, that you're looking for a menu of ideas as well. So for what I would like to talk about today, here's my short little outline. Like to start with the states that have had primaries already and what we've learned from that. And then I'll look at the two broad areas where I believe states can have options. And one is about voting in person, and the other is about voting outside the polling place. And that phrase, voting outside the polling place, is one that I invented. No one else has picked it up, sorry to say. But it refers to absentee voting and mail voting. And in fact, NCSL has been referring to this as absentee/mail voting for quite some time now. And that's the phrase you'll hear me use over and over again today. So all states do offer some in-person voting and some absentee voting already. Before COVID hit, this was certainly true. And so it's sort of a teeter-totter with some people voting in one way and some people voting in the other way. And of course, if you change some policies about it, then the teeter-totter shifts a little bit and more people vote the other way. So it is both the election administrators or policymakers who can shift this, but it's mostly the voters who can shift this. If they say, hey, it's legal for me to vote an absentee ballot, I'm going to figure it out, then they have the opportunity to shift. And if the voters are making the shift, then your state and all the other states are sort of adjusting to that new reality as more people are choosing to vote absentee. I will say that rather than calling this the teeter-totter effect, I'm trying to train myself to refer to this as hybrid elections, with the idea that everybody has a hybrid election. The question is just, where is the emphasis? All right, so I'm going to start with the primaries, and I'll note that any of the primaries that took place before COVID really hit in the middle of March got away easy, you might say, because they could run the primaries in the way that was familiar for them. Georgia, the next set of states were the ones like Georgia that had primaries scheduled for April and May, and they mostly did delay their elections. And the delay we had hoped was going to mean that the coronavirus was under control and we could run normal elections, but as we all know, it remained a concern. So that delay did give states a time to first get their in-person polling places plans adjusted so that they were good for social distancing and for public health protocols, and then also to review their absentee/mail voting procedures, either because they expected more voters to choose to vote that way, or they wanted to encourage more voters to vote that way. So with that background, on this slide, on the vertical axis, we've got the number of voters who, percentage, excuse me, of voters who voted absentee. And on the horizontal slide, we have the primaries as they went along from the pre-COVID time until the middle of June. And then for each state that you see listed there, there's a blue dot at the bottom of a line and an orange dot at the top of the line. And the blue dot represents how many people voted in the 2016 primary election with an absentee ballot, and the orange one represents 2020. So you can see that the states that voted early, they tended to, like from Virginia leftward, New Hampshire to Virginia, those states didn't change too terribly much because of the dates of when their primary elections were run. But after that, you can see that there's a huge increase in the number of people who are voting on an absentee or mail ballot, leaping up from 5% all the way up to 75%, that kind of thing, in state after state after state. That's been the huge story of elections this year, the number of people who are voting absentee. But the second piece of the story about primaries this year has been that it's been difficult in many states to make that shift and have it run smoothly. So I've got a few stories for you from other states where things have gotten lots of press, whether the state wanted it or not. So Wisconsin, its municipal election, not its state primary, was held in April. And the big news story there was long lines in Milwaukee explicitly. And in Wisconsin, the municipalities, not the counties, not the state, are responsible for actually running the elections, for choosing the polling places, recruiting the poll workers, that kind of thing. And Milwaukee was not able to recruit anywhere near the number of election officials that they need, or excuse me, polling workers that they needed to be able to staff the usual 180 polling places. So they had 5 that were open. Now the state did send out absentee ballot requests to voters, but this was trying to meet the needs for an April 7th deadline. So, you know, when COVID hit, there was not very much time in there. And so those ballot request applications didn't necessarily get out to voters. And so people showed up in person. It's worth noting that in Wisconsin, 4.9% of Wisconsinites used absentee mail ballots in 2018. I'm talking 2018 now. And in Georgia, that was 6.1%, but similar, not a large amount of absentee voting in advance. And then Maryland was next up on my list anyway. June 2nd, they faced long lines in Baltimore in particular. In Maryland, instead of sending out ballot request applications, they sent out the ballots to everyone. And the question again was, did the ballots arrive in the mailboxes of voters in a reasonable enough time that they could vote the ballot and get it back on time for the election? And for some folks that wasn't true, so they went to polling places. Baltimore began to realize that they'd scaled down because everybody was going to get an absentee ballot in the mail, but then they scaled back up a little bit, increasing the number of vote centers they had available from 4 to 6, but it still wasn't enough, and Maryland got all kinds of press for the long lines and the delayed election results. I'll do the next 2 states pretty quickly. Nevada was much like Maryland. They sent out absentee ballots to everyone, still had long lines because, again, they had reduced the number of in-person options on primary election day. And then in New York, that's gotten lots of press too. They sent out ballot request applications to voters. That was a brand new process there. People don't vote much by absentee in New York. Lots of confusion, but mostly in New York, the story was about ballots being received and not being able to be processed, that they couldn't get the ballot envelopes open fast enough to do counting. And so results were delayed by several weeks. And also out of New York, we heard that 20% of the absentee ballots that were returned were rejected for one reason or another. So my point is that the election season has been a tricky one for some length of time. States where it went smoother perhaps were states where they were already doing a greater amount of absentee voting. So when they saw an increase that was scaling up from 25% or even 50% to 70%, much different than scaling up from 5%. I'm going to take down my slides for just a moment while I think if I can get myself organized to do that and talk about in-person voting. Okay, I can't. I think I'll just leave them be. I hope that's okay with everybody. I don't want to have technology get in the way here. So we don't have to look at the slide anymore. I just want to say that in-person voting is always tricky. Election officials are tasked with deciding how many polling places need to be open at any given time. They do that based on their historical records. Well, this year, historical records aren't nearly as helpful as in others. Oh, okay. So it's been harder this year. First, as I've mentioned, many voters who wanted to use an absentee ballot didn't get it in enough time to return it. And so that meant that they gave up and they went to the polling places in addition to all the people who were originally planning on going. So that made planning harder. And it wasn't just that though, it was also that it was hard to get polling places and poll workers. And if you can't have polling places that say, yes, you can run your election here, or if you can't find poll workers who are willing to work it, then you can't staff as many facilities. So it was partly the voters coming at the last minute, partly polling places not being available, and partly poll workers not being available. And on the poll worker side, I'm guessing that a lot of messaging has already gone out in Georgia to prepare for November. I'm guessing your state is thinking of encouraging high schoolers, and I know 16-year-olds and up can serve as poll workers in your state. College students, community college students, public employees, and others are all going to need to be recruited to take on this role in November. Wisconsin used the National Guard. They served in plain clothes. They were trained as all of the poll workers. They didn't look like National Guard. And in many parts of the state, that was much appreciated and something that could be thought about. I've been told that in the rest of the country, schools are closed on election day and that the teachers serve as poll workers. I don't quite see that coming together between now and November, but an interesting side point. And then on the polling places themselves, there is a voting location siting tool that is free and available from the Center for Inclusive Democracy. And its purpose is to help local election officials make data-driven decisions about where and how many polling places they'll need. And also I'll point out that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have provided public health protocols specific for polling places. I'm sure that your folks are up to date on that piece as well. But there's another issue in regard to in-person voting, and that is who's in charge of making these decisions. Is this a state decision or is it a local decision? I understand that in Georgia, there are two entities at the state level, your Secretary of State as your chief election official and a state election board. Georgia is one of just 7 states where those responsibilities at the state level are shared between 2 entities. And then again, at the local level, I understand that Georgia shares the responsibilities between a county board of registrars and also a judge of probate. I don't know the details on who does what. Again, in a majority of states, this responsibility at the local level is usually vested with just one person. It's often the county clerk, and sometimes it's a state local election board. Regardless of who the entities are, nationwide, 48% of states do give the responsibility for choosing polling places to the local election officials. The 2 exceptions to that are South Carolina and Rhode Island. And I'm sure that your in-state experts can describe way better than I can how local officials choose polling places in Georgia. In general, though, around the nation, local election officials base planning for future elections on past elections, as I mentioned before. Again, particularly tricky this year, given the need for social distancing and the uncertainty, it can be really hard. Also, I want to say it's hard to make assumptions based on the primary. Yes, a lot of people tried to vote absentee in the primary, but ended up in the polling places. So when a voter looks to November, they read that there were long lines. Does that mean they will work harder to get an absentee ballot early in the process? Or will those who realize that there were some problems with getting an absentee ballot say, I'm going to vote early in person and skip that process? And it was really hard to tell which way that they will go. Before moving on, I'll just say 3 more things about in-person voting. The first is that by providing ample early in-person voting, you can flatten the curve of voting on election day. And Georgia is right there at the midpoint with the other states in terms of how much early voting you provide. I've counted it as 15 days of early voting is available, and the national average is 19, very similar. Some states expressly require that weekend voting be available. In Georgia, I think Saturday voting is an option, a local option. My second point is that some states are moving towards curbside voting. And with this, people can stay in their car and someone will assist them from curbside. And this is something that's been around for a long time, always for the purpose of helping people with disabilities who have mobility and can't get into the polling place to be able to vote. And now this year, people are saying perhaps this could be used for many people. And in fact, the state of Utah allowed their counties to provide curbside or car-based voting instead of in-building voting during the primary. And they set this up in fairgrounds and other large facilities and had lines that kind of traveled along from station to station. And then my last point before suggesting we take a few questions about this, Mr. Chairman, that'll be your choice, of course, is that it could be that voters are confused this year. And I think every single state is thinking about what can they do about voter education. There's always some amount of effort on voter education, but probably never as necessary as this state. What are the options? How do they get expressed in a formal and official way to the voters? And is it possible for the same message to be carried from the state level to the local level, for every elected official to share the same message, community groups as well? I have seen a Georgia YouTube video on how to vote. That's out there. I don't know if voters have seen it so that they're familiar with the equipment you've got or not. And there again, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to stop and take some questions before I go on to absentee/mail, or I'm happy to run right on, whatever you prefer.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions at this time? Anybody on Zoom have any questions? If you just want to chat, message. I'm not seeing any. So Ms. Underhill, I guess we'll continue on, and I imagine there are probably some questions being saved until the end if you will entertain those.
Absolutely. Well, here we go. As I've mentioned before, NCSL does not recommend policy choices. So what I'm about to share with you is informational and not making any recommendations for you. And what I've got is based on our web report that's called Voting Outside the Polling Place. And that report outlines many of the policy choices we'll touch on today regarding absentee and mail voting. We prepared this report in 2019. We were doing it based on the fact that over 20 years, more and more people had been slowly moving from in-person voting to absentee/mail voting, and that states were seeing that as voters made that choice, they needed to adjust some of their procedures. So this was not created with COVID in mind. It was convenient for us when COVID hit that we did have a lot of these details already rounded up. Because of the coronavirus, almost all states have done something to make it easier to request an absentee ballot this year. For instance, of the 16 states that require voters to provide an excuse to get an absentee ballot, 13 have declared, at least for the primaries, that concerns about COVID-19 were sufficient under their existing laws, didn't take a change in the law. Georgia, of course, is not one of those excuse states. Also, 16 states chose to mail absentee ballot applications to all registered and active voters for the primary elections, and that included Georgia. With this decision to send an application out, it remains the voter's choice if they want to vote that way. They are responsible for filling out that application and getting it back in and taking it from there. By making that choice, you're sort of nudging voters in that direction perhaps, but it is still a voter's choice for sure. And I am aware that, I'm unaware of any states that did this prior to 2020. So this really is a COVID special to send out ballot applications. But I do know that about 10 states have indicated that they plan to do this for the general election as well. And now I'm going to go back to my slides. Oh, there's the delays. I mentioned that earlier. You can see where states delayed. There's a southern and the eastern trend. I think that relates more to when their primaries are scheduled than it does to any policy choices in particular. And then I want to talk about online portals for requesting an absentee ballot. This is a bit like online voter registration in that a voter with the right registration and ID and such things can go online and make that request electronically to get a ballot sent to them. There's some advantages to doing it this way, one of which is that there's less operator error, less information being keyed into any system, and of course it makes it a little quicker, and you skip the part where the person has to mail in a request form. And some of the states had already had these up, others are doing it now. I have Georgia listed as in the act of creating a portal at this point that should be available for voting in November. Then the next option I want to look at is called mailing ballots out, not just ballot applications. And I'm going to use the phrase universal mail voting for this to differentiate it from just the states where there's a general increase in the number of people who are voting by mail ballots. And here in orange, we have 5 states that have adopted this as their primary mode of running elections. And I vote in Colorado, one of the states that's in that camp. So I'm familiar with receiving a ballot for every election that comes along. Then the states in blue are ones that have said that for the November 2020 election, they're going to send a ballot to all active voters. They aren't making a policy choice at this point about what they're going to do in the future, but they've decided that it's important for them for this year. And then I also included Arizona and Montana on this. Is my screen up for you all, or is that a problem?
No, we don't have your presentation up. And I will say that the portal you mentioned, I think that's something that the Board of Elections has taken up today, actually.
Let me try sharing again. And you're right. Let's try this. Now, do you see my slides? I bet you do now. Okay, so let's go. Yes, and you just told me that you're looking at the online portal for today, and here's the map that you couldn't see. I'm so sorry. The orange states have online, universal mail elections all the time. The blue ones have agreed to do it for the 2020 November election, have not made policy choices beyond that. And Montana and Arizona are heavy users of mail voting, although they haven't gone all the way to universal vote by mail yet. So then helping voters access an absentee or mail ballot by using an online portal or mailing out the application or providing the ballot is a way to encourage this. But the second question is, how do you manage it when you get additional ballots in through this process? And so then there's a whole lot of fine points to how to process those ballots. And I thought I would provide just a few of those for you. I did provide a Georgia specific report on absentee voting that kind of shows on 21 points where Georgia stands in regard to the rest of the nation in making absentee/mail voting easy and secure. The first three things on that report were about voter registration, and I will point out that Georgia is a member of the Electronic Registration Information Center, so already participating in the nation's best organization to help keep voter lists up to date, which is the precursor for running good elections, whether they're in a polling place and especially if there's more absentee voting. So I'm not addressing that. So I've got 7 points to look at quickly, and then I'll wrap up. The first is some states do have a permanent absentee voting list. In addition to all of those universal mail voting states, there are 5 other states that do allow people to say, I want to receive an absentee ballot, not only for this election, but for all elections to come. Then signature verification, that's often considered the best approach to securing that the ballot that's in that envelope is cast by the voter of record, by the person who is sending it in. It's apparently quite hard to fake a signature, and so states that can compare the signature on the outside of the envelope to the signature of record are using that, and Georgia is in fact doing that. And then voters might want to be sure that their that their ballot is received and has been approved for counting. Is that possible for them to check it? In Georgia, yes, indeed, it is possible to check that. And can processing of these ballots begin before Election Day? In the past, when only 5 or 10% of ballots were cast through mail or absentee voting, this didn't matter very much. When you all of a sudden get to 20%, 40%, or 70% in some states, this is a huge deal, because if you have to open up the envelopes on Election Day, it takes a while to count them. And I'm fairly sure that for your primary, you did allow the opening of the envelopes and the processing, but not the counting prior to Election Day. And so that's why I put maybe up there. Does the voter have an opportunity to cure a signature problem, fix it? If the signature doesn't match, is there a way for them to fix it? Can the election officials communicate with the voter and give them that opportunity? And the answer in Georgia is yes. So that means that there's fewer absentee ballots that go uncounted. Is postage prepaid? In Georgia, it is not, and that means Georgia is with the majority of states. 5 years ago, there was hardly a state anywhere that was thinking about prepaid postage. Now, up to 16 states for this year are providing prepaid postage. It's still, as I say, not the norm by any stretch. And then the last piece I've got is, must ballots be received by Election Day? In Georgia, the answer is yes. That is with the majority of states. If you receive your ballots by election day, then you can process them in a timely fashion. If they're permitted to come in for 3 days, 5 days, even up to 10 days afterwards, that's an okay policy choice, but everyone, including voters and candidates, need to understand that that could easily mean that the final tabulation will be delayed. So at the beginning, I said that my top line comment was that all states are working to find a path forward that allows everyone to, who is eligible to vote, to do so in a safe manner. My second takeaway I've already mentioned as well, and that is voter education is a super important component always, and especially this year, so that people know what are the rules of the road, what are the ways that they can vote, and that messaging should include, please make your choice early. With that, that's what I have prepared. I am happy to take questions now or after the fact. There's my email address if anyone wants to be in communication with me further, and I wait for your questions, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Underhill. You finished quick.
I did quicker than I thought.
That was, you got it narrowed down. I think we do have a question. I'm sure we'll have a few more. So I'm going to try to work this thing. I have to get everybody's microphone just right. So if Miss Underhill, when you get a question, it may take a half a second for me to switch it. If you'll pause before you start to answer, it'll save us a little bit of time going back and forth. So thank you again. Wonderful presentation. I believe 7. Did you have a question? Was first. You're number 2. Oh, you're number 6. Okay.
Thank you very much for your information this morning. I'm trying to educate myself on portals. Do any of the application process that go into a portal result in a ballot being electronically sent to the applicant, or are 100% of the portals resulting in a mailed ballot to the voter?
Thank you for that question, Representative Oliver. I'm going to say 100% result in a paper ballot being mailed to the voter. The only reason I give you the slightest hesitation on that is perhaps you're asking about online voting, and is that happening anywhere? We know that with our overseas voters, they do receive an electronic ballot, or they receive, yes, we communicate with them electronically. They must receive their ballot in an electronic format, and how they return it is different. But those are overseas voters. That's a different kettle of fish than what this online portal is intended to do. And again, if you wanted to drill down into the tiniest details, there are a few jurisdictions that have some kind of a phone-based opportunity for people with disabilities, as well as overseas people, to actually vote on their phone and submit a ballot that way. But I hesitate to even mention that because that is a minuscule part. There is virtually no groundswell for any transmitting of ballots electronically around the nation, not something that the technology is up to date on enough for.
The portal eliminates the first mailing task of the voter, but it remains the second mailing obligation of the voter.
The local election official definitely needs to mail the ballot to the voter. And then in most states, the voter has the choice of mailing it back or bringing it into an election office or using a drop box to return it. So where I vote in Colorado, most people choose to drop off their ballot as opposed to send it back through the mail.
One final question, Mr. Chairman. How many states did you say have made mail-in ballots free of postage?
I have that right here. Let me go back. I think the answer was 16, but I'm sorry, I've lost my paper, but it's in that ballpark. I can answer something.
Thank you. Representative Nguyen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions about signature match. In your presentation, you did go over signature match, and Georgia does have it. I'm curious to know, are there other states who have the exact signature match policy for the application portion, not just the ballot itself, but the application to vote by mail?
We do have details on what is required with a ballot application to be able to receive the ballot. So that's the first step. You can't, so that you do have to sign your ballot application as well. And there are about 4 or 5 states that require a second signature at that point, someone from a witness or a notary. That's really uncommon. Here too, if I took a moment, I could pull it up and I could tell you what the requirements are for the ballot application requests, but I don't think I can do it without going online and pulling up another document.
Have the states that do require the signature match, have there been issues on either lack of uniformity on how that signature match is carried out, or just issues on, for example, in Georgia, we're using, in some cases, the signature that we're using on a stylus pen, which looks a lot different from what our signature might look like when we're signing on pen and paper, which has caused errors with the signature match policy.
There may be 2 parts to that question, and one may relate to my official given name is Wendla Underhill, Wendla A. Underhill, but I go by Wendy, and sometimes I sign one and sometimes I sign the other. And if that's your question, Georgia is fairly unique in asking that the exact name be used in all parts of it. If you're asking more about the signature match, which is I think where we're headed, what does it look like, the imaging? There are different ways to do this. The stylus does give a much less good signature. In Colorado, they have like a whole series of my signatures over the course of the years. When I first registered to vote, they captured that, and every time I've sent a ballot since then, so they can see over time a shift in a person's signature. And of course, we do know that as people age, often their signature changes because of shakiness or other things. So it's not a precise science, but with training from law enforcement type people, there can be standards set for what is a signature match and what isn't. In the states that use this, there's usually a bipartisan team that ends up making the choice, and if they're not on the same page, then it goes up to a higher level for adjudication. This is before the ballot is even removed. So we don't know whether that ballot's going to, what's in that ballot. The conversation is about, is that signature going to be counted? And I'll also note that in some states, they use some technology to assist, but it never replaces the judgment of human beings. So the technology in Colorado includes that that when the ballot comes through and is processed, they take a picture of the signature, and then on a screen, there's the signature on record plus the brand new signature that's just been signed, one right next to the other. So people aren't shuffling paper to make this happen. They're looking at images on the screen, which is how you can have like a history of what your signature has looked like. I hope that was helpful.
And I have one more question. So as you mentioned before, we know that a lot of states are new to the majority of the population voting by mail because of the pandemic. But in Colorado, your state has been implementing a universal vote by mail policy. Can you share with us just the transition from the transition that the state went through in terms of instilling voter confidence, the education portion? I think some of the concerns that have been brought up in the past are just people aren't familiar with vote by mail, but there are obviously states who have always employed vote by mail as their main mechanism of voting.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. When it was 2013 when the legislature went to the universal mail voting. Caveat here, they don't like to think of it that way because they do provide ample numbers of voter service centers during the early voting period and on election day. So they don't really like it if I call them an all-mail state, because they do have some in-person options available, which really do provide a variety of services. Okay, 2013. But when we were in 2013, already well over 70% of people were choosing to vote on an absentee ballot. And that had been true since, or had been building over the 10 years prior to that. And one decision point earlier on that helped it build was when Colorado created a permanent absentee voter list and allowed people to sign up just once to receive an absentee ballot for all elections going into the future. Now, when I say all elections, you have to continue to be an active voter. If you haven't voted in 1 or 2 elections, probably 2, they're not going to send it to you. You're still a registered voter, but you need to take action if you want to get back into it. So 2013 is a key moment, but so was, I think it was 2008, I'm not quite sure about that, when the permanent absentee list went into being. That was a key moment as well. And then I think the clerks over time just encouraged people to do this. The clerks felt this was to their advantage because it made election day less stressful. So they had an incentive, and the clerks were not 100% in favor of this when the big shift went, but they were mostly in favor of it because they believed, and I think it's been borne out, that making the shift meant that instead of running 2 elections, 2 big elections, one with all of the polling places and one with 70% of the people voting absentee, they could put their focus mostly on the one side. So it felt like a resource conserving move. Now, you asked about from the voters' perspective. I don't remember that there were, because it would have been gradual, I don't think there was a huge concern at 2013 in the methodology. We already had the signature verification in place. We already have the opportunity for anyone in the community to observe the signature matching process, to observe the counting of the absentee ballots. I don't remember a big issue about the public being concerned. I think George is a different situation just because of your history of having a small amount, and so making big moves all at once would easily raise those kinds of concerns.
Ms. Underhill, real quick, I know we have some other questions, but were the decisions in those 16 states, were they unilateral decisions, or did they go through the legislative process? Just curious how that played out, if you know.
Yes, sir. And again, I can give you the exact right answer for every single state after the fact, but in general, in the primary elections, it was executive branch action that led to the sending out of ballot applications to voters, or led in a few states to sending ballots out during the primary to all voters. So those 2 systems. And it was interesting to see that most legislatures were in recess because of COVID and couldn't act as fast as the executive branch could. Now I'm seeing legislatures coming back in. Pennsylvania did sign off on the mailing of the applications out, and so did Illinois. I believe those are the 2 states where it was done through legislative action. But it's as if in the heat of the moment, the executive branch can take action. Then it's time for the legislature to consider what is the right policy going forward. Did that address what you were asking, Chairman?
To some degree. I just wondered how that process played out in some of those other states.
I can respond with follow-up.
Representative Shannon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question about curbside voting. Can you tell me which areas of the country are doing curbside voting, and also what impact that's had on reducing the time it takes to vote?
Thank you, Representative Shannon, for that question. I'm aware that that's a option in North Carolina. I mentioned that it was being used in Utah. I believe that some of the Wisconsin municipal election used it. But it is minuscule in terms of trying to keep people out of polling places. It's a new idea. I see that the U.S. Election Assistance Commission is starting to put some focus on that as an option. It does require a whole new logistical plan how do people drive up? How are their identities confirmed? How do they vote? Are you bringing them a paper ballot? Are you bringing them a tablet? And I know you have new equipment, and I don't know whether you can carry it out to a car or not. I really don't have any idea about that. So it's an idea. It's a small one though, and I can provide more information if after the fact. I don't know much, but I have to go look it up and be happy to do that for you.
Do we have anybody on Zoom that has any questions? Zooming in. No further. Anybody? I do have a couple of questions, Miss Underhill, if you don't mind. We talk about a grand number of things regarding voting, and I know you mentioned the absentee to a great degree. For those that would, we had some testimony as we've gone through this process that it's created some, some instances where people could possibly, be voting, somebody else's ballot. We had one lady that raised a ballot and said that, somebody had passed 4 years prior and she got an absentee ballot request form. So from a security standpoint, I mean, are there things that certain states are doing? Is there something that says, okay, this makes it, we can do this right this way, or this is, one of the more secure ways to do it, or is there just a spectrum of different ways that it's being done?
Thank you for that question. It is fair to say that over the course of history, absentee ballots have been a source of election shenanigans, not so much on the part of voters as potentially campaign people. And I'm sure you're familiar with North Carolina's congressional election in 2018, where a campaign operative collected and used absentee ballots to sway the vote. So what can you do to stop that? North Carolina is one of the states that requires someone, in addition to the voter, to sign the envelope as a witness. And that may have made sense some decades ago, before there was the possibility of doing a confirmation on the signature of the voter to be sure that that's really who did it. I'm not sure it adds an element of security is what I'm offering on that. So one thing that adds security is to be sure that the voter lists are as clean as you can make them. And every state has its own processes within the federal law on how to do that. Then you're only mailing out ballots to voters at an address that is appropriate and recently updated. So you want ballots to go to voters at real addresses. You don't want them to be dumped in foyers of apartment buildings, that kind of thing. And I have not seen ballots ever dumped in foyers of apartment buildings. Ballot applications, that did happen in some New Jersey places this year, and that certainly is a very bad look, and you don't want that happening either, but it's very different if it's an application than if it's the ballot itself. Okay, so the voter gets the ballot, and there are occasions where a voter might want assistance. Perhaps they are their literacy is lower, or perhaps they think that their friend has better judgment about political things. So it's not unreasonable that the voter might say to a spouse or a friend or someone else, hey, I'm about to vote this, what do you think I should do? That's the voter's choice to have that kind of encouragement. What we don't want is coercion, and that could come from a employee, for instance, and California just enacted a law saying that employers can't ask employees, to bring ballots into the office to avoid that kind of thing. And I don't think there's much you can do about spouse on spouse coercion, because once it gets in the envelope, if the spouse signs it, then off it goes. I do think it helps when some number of your voters do use their ballot tracking system to say, hey, where is my ballot? Why hasn't it arrived? Hey, and now I want to know if it's been received by you. So if some people are tracking it, then that sort of provides an audit of it. And then the last thing I'd offer is that absentee ballots, once they're out of the envelope, and the signature has been approved, and we believe that the voter was the one who put it in the ballot because they signed for it. There is one more little hitch there, and that is that more absentee ballots have problems that mean they can't be counted. This is when they use X's instead of filling in the circles, or they draw lines to say, no, I didn't mean this and I did mean that. And then those ballots, or at least the races where that kind of thing is a little mixed up, are not counted. Now, some states have voter intent laws. That's where they'll say if they chose X's instead of filling in the circle, we'll still count it. And oftentimes state election officials can outline what does voter intent mean, so that when one of those ballots is rejected from the optical scan machine as having an unreadable race, then a bipartisan team can look at that race, and if they can identify what was the intent of the voter, then it can be counted.
Thank you. Representative Bernal on Zoom, so I may not be able to. Representative Bernal, the floor is yours if you have a question, ma'am.
Yes. Good morning. Thank you for that, all that valuable information. Since most people, like, say, for example, I registered to vote when I moved to Georgia 25 years ago. And so that was before we had all the exact match. So how do you know, I signed my name one way, like my husband, he's real funny about that, you should write your name real correctly, but I have my own way to write my name. And so how do you know if your signature matches? I mean, should you go back and look and see?
Representative Bruno, that is a question I don't know the answer to. Might be one that the Secretary's staff could answer. In Colorado, I know that if I sign W.A. Underhill and Wendy Underhill and Wendla Underhill at different times, they're looking at whether the W is the same and the U is the same, and the way I trail off on the L's is the same. So all of those are accepted, but I do know you have an exact match, and so I'm not sure how that would be handled in terms of looking at those signatures.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple of questions, and I'd like to go back to the curbside. I'm curious as to how it can be done and stay, I guess, secure and privacy. Is someone actually casting the ballot for you, or is there a machine they bring up, or how does that work?
Thank you, Representative Taylor, for that question. I can offer two thoughts on this. The Utah model, where they really did shift away from an in the building voting model to an in the parking lot voting model, they had like a trail that you followed, and you stopped at station number 1 and showed them your ID, and they sent you on with a piece of paper to, this is approximate, please don't hold me to it, I can get the exact details, sent you on to get your ballot. In Utah, they use paper ballots for everything. So then you're handed the ballot that's appropriate for you. Then you're shifted off to another place where you vote that ballot privately in your car, and it has an envelope. You put it in the envelope, and then you go to another place and you drop it off as if you were putting a letter in a mailbox. So there's several stations along the way, but you are indeed voting privately. If the concern is in more normal curbside voting for someone who has a disability, perhaps their caregiver drives them up to the polling place. The caregiver goes in and says, I have someone who needs curbside assistance. A bipartisan team of workers goes out to the car and assist that person in voting with as much privacy as they are able to arrange for that person. And if that means wheeling out a piece of voting equipment, if it means bringing out a tablet, or if it means bringing out a paper ballot, you're counting on that bipartisan team to turn away while the decisions are being made.
You. Another question has to do with, I know this year with the pandemic, there were a number of places that had last minute changes and they had the workers not show up. Who is ultimately responsible is to making sure that these don't happen again? Where does this, I guess, fall? Is it a local? Everybody really needs to be working together on these, but that's one of the questions that has come up with us.
Thank you for that question. It is, generally speaking, a local responsibility to stand up polling places. And I can see every reason why people at the state level would want to know how that's going and not hear about it at 9 a.m. on election day, maybe know at 6 a.m. on election day that you're not going to be able to open as many as you otherwise might. It takes, if it truly is a question of people, poll workers bailing on the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday before election day, it's hard to regroup and get everything opened. And you can't just put any old body in there to be a poll worker. They have to be someone who's been trained. And I'm sure Georgia has standards on training for poll workers too. So you need far more poll workers who are trained, ready to step in at the last moment. And you need almost SWAT team who can go anywhere, at least within a county, if not across county lines. Now, I think that the technology and the processing is the same in Georgia throughout all of the counties. So perhaps there could be a group of people who are somehow able to deploy into local jurisdictions in more than one county. That I'm not really sure of. I can imagine that the state might decide that they want a report a month in advance or 2 weeks in advance of how things are going. Where are these polling places going to be? How many are you going to have? How does that compare to in the past? I have not found other states where that's a requirement, but I do know that that's where the communication between the state and the locals is working smoothly. You're going to have fewer of those problems. Yet we are in a pandemic. It's hard to control for all the possibilities.
Mr. Chairman, one last question, and that actually is something I don't think we have an issue with at the moment, but in certain places, like I'll use Portland, and last night I believe they had a lot of rioting in Chicago. Are there security issues that are being addressed at a state level to make sure that our polling places are secure? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I haven't been asked that
Is
before.
that a question for Ms. Andrea? I believe that Ms. Taylor was, Representative Taylor was, I messed up from a technology standpoint, Ms. Underhill. So if you had an answer to that, we didn't hear it.
I don't have much of an answer for you, I'm afraid, Mr. Chairman. I do know that many states have prohibitions on guns in polling places, and that is so that people feel secure. I know that there are often prohibitions on police being deployed on a proactive basis outside polling places, because that can have a deterrent effect depending on who's coming to vote. That may be different this year than it has been in previous years. But I do know that there are that there's a close communication on security around elections with like federal and state workers waiting to hear about cybersecurity type security issues. I'm guessing that they're also waiting to hear about any physical security type issues. I don't know, other than those two things about the guns in the polling places and police at polling places, whether there are state laws. It may be that this is something that contingency planning is required for. What do you do in case of a fire? What do you do in case of an active shooter? What do you do in the case of protests that might be blocking the entryway? So I think that's state and local contingency planning working together. And then let us please pray that that does not come to pass in Georgia or elsewhere.
Ms. Underhill, I'm afraid I'll forget this. So I was going to ask it as a little bit of a follow-up. And on the curbside, is that, can you only vote one person per car, or multiple people allowed to vote?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. I can tell that I'm going to spend the rest of today looking into curbside voting for all of you, and I will share what I can learn about past examples and any plans being made for the future. But that's an excellent question, because you could certainly bring a car full of 4 or 5 people and do it together. I will find out.
Representative Nguyen?
Mr. Chair. This is a sort of a follow-up question. So there's been a lot of messaging about vote by mail creating massive amounts of fraud, but there just hasn't seemed to be any factual evidence to back that up. Can you talk about the percentage of voter fraud by mail and how that compares to in-person?
Yes, Representative Nguyen, happy to do so. In both cases, individual voter fraud is extremely rare. There are cases that show up where a person has voted an absentee ballot and then goes to a polling place and asks to vote again. Most of those people are elderly and may have memory issues. There are these kinds of examples are collated at the Heritage Foundation, and I'd be happy to share the links for you on that afterwards. Another thing that comes up where depending on how you look at it, could be absentee voter fraud, is when a person has a summer home in one place and a winter home in another, and they think they can vote in both. That they often think, quite realistically, I can vote in both. They're not trying to be fraudulent. And whether that's is in fact fraudulent depends on the state and the laws that are associated with it. So that kind of double voting is only possible because of absentee voting. And then I guess the third piece is what I mentioned before: is there a ballot collection operation going on? And ballot collection can be nothing but like a get out the vote campaign, where in Colorado, they allow any individual person to go collect up to 10 ballots from other people and drop them off. And so people might knock on your door and say, have you voted yet? Would you like me to take your ballot back for you? Most voters don't like that anymore. They don't want someone knocking at the door, for starters, and the security question is very much in play. So I think Colorado might be the most generous in that regard, and other states might reduce it to 5 votes could be collected, or even only your ballot can be returned by yourself, a family member, a caregiver, and I think that's the law in Georgia. And I guess I want to say again, the ballot collection doesn't have to be nefarious, but you can imagine that you could come to the door and say, hey, I think you've got an absentee ballot. Do you need some help filling it out? So that could lead to some coercion, which is where the restrictions on who can return a ballot might come into play. So there is not evidence of massive fraud with absentee ballots. It's these small pieces, some of which you can control for, and to some extent, there's probably never been an election that's been run perfectly in person or absentee, and we keep trying to find the way to secure it so that only eligible voters can vote, and yet that all eligible voters can do it fairly easily.
Representative Turner via Zoom. I'll turn your mic on, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mrs. Underhill, for being here today and for your presentation. When you say that there's never been a really big instance of fraud, we've seen evidence here in Georgia. Actually, one of our congressmen has a staffer on his staff who received absentee ballot applications from his home here in Georgia, which he hasn't lived here for quite some time. He received absentee ballots from the district because he had rented an apartment for a short period of time, and from his new home state where he lives now, where he's a resident in Maryland. And I believe there was a fourth application that he received. The congressman took to Twitter and he showed one photo with 4 absentee ballot applications for one individual that worked on his staff. Obviously there's some of that is there's different jurisdictions involved, but even here in Georgia, we've heard stories about people in DeKalb County specifically. There's a gentleman who posted a photo of him receiving multiple absentee ballots for people who no longer lived at his address. We have actual members of this committee who would tell you that we shouldn't be purging our voter rolls or updating our voter rolls and tell you that, you know, once somebody's on the registered voter list, they should always be there. But what are the states doing differently to keep that type of thing from happening, where it's maybe it's not happening, but the potential for fraud is there, and the effect of voter confidence takes a knock whenever we hear stories like that. And in the age of social media, these stories get out and they spread like wildfire. You know, I have a large group of contingency of folks that I represent are telling me, don't do any mail ballots, because what ends up happening is these folks get absentee ballots, and while we do have an exact signature match statute here in Georgia, there are people even on this committee that would advocate against that type of security measure. So what are the states doing to try to mitigate that, and how are they being successful at mitigating that risk?
Thank you for that question. And I especially like that you were able to bring that real true example of a staffer who got 4 absentee ballot applications. This looks bad, but this is not what you want to have happen. And yet you were clear that these are applications. He didn't necessarily fill them out and go get those ballots. It still doesn't look good. It's not fraud, but it sure doesn't look good, and it damages voter confidence, and voter confidence is an important part of running American elections, no matter how you're running them. On the who's getting sent a application, that relates to who's on your voter registration rolls, and that relates to how clean are those rolls, and that relates to using the Electronic Registration Information Center, ERIC, to try to see where somebody is registered in more than one state. And it's not illegal to be registered in more than one state. When people move, possibly that staffer, I don't know, probably didn't report back. And my daughters, when they move from state to state, they don't tell the last state that they're no longer registered there. They just register in their new state. So it's not, I mean, I'd like my daughters to do that, but it's not required by law, and very few people do that when they're making a move. So you end up on rolls in more than one state, and the way you look at that is by comparing with other states and then taking action. And the action that I'm assuming Georgia is taking is to send notes to people saying, we see that you are now registered in Maryland. Does that mean we can cancel your registration here? So that's a process that's never perfect at any one moment, because people are coming on and people are going off, and you're doing that mailing out to people at a certain time, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. I don't know how often it's done, but it's hard to have it be clean at every moment, at every time. Likewise with people who have died, how do they come off the rolls? Sometimes family members let people know, sometimes obituaries are found, sometimes state or Social Security records are used to look for people who've died, so that we're not sending out ballot applications, much less ballots, to people who are no longer with us. So I guess I'd say that that's number one. And then number 2 would be, when that application comes back in, what is the signature match? And Representative Wynn asked about the signature match on the ballot applications, and I'll follow up on that. And then number 3 is, when the ballot comes back, does it match what's on record? That's the primary method for ensuring that only the voter who was supposed to be registered in Georgia has voted.
So it's a combination of 2 things, if I'm hearing this correctly. Number 1 is a clean voter roll, where we're purging bad data and making sure that only eligible voters are on the rolls. And that's an ongoing process. It never stops. It's always something we must be doing moving forward. And the second is the signature match part of making sure that the person that requested the absentee is the person who got the actual ballot before they mail it back in.
Yes, sir.
So those are vitally important pieces of that type of policy. Thank you.
I also offer that I think people who are proponents for more mail voting would also add in that if you have a post-election audit, that could help, but I'm not sure that that actually helps with who voted the ballot. I think that helps to show that the results were in fact what the ballots would show to be the results.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ms. Underhill, if one final question, I've been getting some via text and whatnot, but I just, thinking about some of our conversation and your, expertise in this area and vast knowledge across the country. If we have 3 weeks of early voting, you mentioned the 15 days, we have in-person voting, day of election, anybody in the state can request and submit an absentee ballot. Where does that rank on the scale of, of availability? I mean, it seems like, there's ample opportunity to vote here, but I don't know how that compares with other states. Do you have any kind of working knowledge on that?
Well, yes, sir. NCSL has a rule against ranking states, so I hesitate to share what I'm about to share with you. In a report from the National Vote at Home Institute, which is an organization that encourages more mail and absentee voting because of a variety of things. Mostly, I think they're motivated by not so much about COVID, but cost savings and what they think is improved security. They give you 3 stars out of a total of 4 stars. And they aren't necessarily looking at that early voting piece. They're looking at the way that you manage your absentee ballots. They may have some places where they think you could do a few more things to encourage people, but they think the way you're handling them is pretty good. I'd say that your in-person early voting is right at the mark for what other states are doing, and there are still many states that don't have any in-person early voting. That's about 10 states don't offer that at all. The outside limit of that is some states open up early in-person voting 45 days in advance, but that's mighty quiet until you get closer to election day. It's, I guess if people wanted to say you need to make it easier, same-day registration might be something that could be changed, and that way a person who's moved to the state recently or didn't think about this until the time could bring in proof that they do live in the state. So that's a thing people might suggest would be making it even easier. But there's on the things that are the key, how much early voting in person is there, what does it take to get an absentee ballot? You're right there in the middle of the pack or above the pack. I hate to use those kinds of words because I think you're asking me what should be different in Georgia, and I really can't say that because you are doing the obvious things.
Well, I guess I'm thinking with, a lot of the chaos that we saw regarding elections and, our primary situation was due to, the COVID situation. You had a bit of a perfect storm. You had extra absentee ballots. I guess where I was going is pre-COVID. I mean, if you have access for everybody, it's not limited to any specific populations. If you have 3 weeks of early voting, you have voting in person. That's an awful lot of ways to cast your ballot and be heard. And I just wondered how that, whether that is a fair statement or if, but it sounds like that there's a lot of varying degrees and that we do pretty good. Is that fair to say?
Yes. And I mean, on each end, we can take several different policy places and I can show you X states do it and Y states don't. And you're with the majority on almost everything that we've talked about today. I guess as we prepare for the November election, the place that we around the nation people can make change is in talking not just about who's on the ballot, but how do you vote. And it's sort of unfortunate the voters have to be smart about how to vote, which should be sort of a normal, natural thing. But this is a year where nothing is normal and natural anymore. So encouraging people to make a plan for how they're going to vote early enough because if it's one thing to say I'm going to vote, it's another to say, yeah, I've got that application. They could be, if they want to vote absentee, they could be asking for those ballots right now. The ballots wouldn't be mailed now, but their request could be in the pipeline so that there's not huge volume of requests that comes at the last minute. And while we're out encouraging voters on that front, if we could encourage them to offer to be poll workers if they feel comfortable with that, and that's very much an individual decision. And if they're concerned about the security aspects, if they could visit with their election officials in their local community. Usually those folks are welcoming to anybody to come in and see in advance, how do we do this? What are the processes? What are the steps we go through? So it's maybe a messaging. And in fact, this is a year where misinformation is rampant and a major concern with elections. So if the official people can get messaging that's equally strong out there about how to make this election go as smoothly as we can, even though there's so many unknowns, that would be great.
Well, the resources are limited at the county level, and they're limited to some degree, obviously Secretary of State's office beyond that. So, how do you do this in a way so that, everybody that wants to vote can vote and vote once and do it in a simple, easy way. But we also know that if we, overwhelm the resources, we overwhelm what we have in place, infrastructure, that the resources are not there. And then that causes, an inverse effect. So that is kind of the reason. Does that make any sense? I don't know if you have any comment.
It does. You have to decide how to use your state resources and the new federal resources that have been made available. And I'm sure your Secretary of State is willing to talk with you about how those are being used. And to some extent, maybe what we're talking, or what I'm offering, is that we need the real resources from the top on how to vote. But then it becomes a question of the messaging, and can we all share on our social media platforms what we know to be true, and these other things. Whether that's sufficient to get everyone on the same page remains to be seen.
Well, thank you again. I don't see any other questions. Does anybody have any comments or anything? Representative Shannon?
Just one final question, Ms. Hill. You mentioned before about the incident that happened in North Carolina, and that sticks out to me as the biggest, example that you would see of people doing voter fraud. But this year, obviously, a lot of states moved to absentee and mail-in voting because of COVID. Have there been, obviously there's been mistakes with absentee ballots sent out maybe too many times, but which is not fraud. Have you seen so far from our elections in other states, do you have any information of actual voter fraud where somebody actually took the step to return more than one absentee ballot, or any of that with all the absentee balloting that's going on across the country? Have you actually seen any real examples or a serious amount of voter fraud?
Thank you for that question. No, I don't have any information on that. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It means it hasn't hit the press yet. And over the course of the 10 years I've been looking at elections, prosecuting voter fraud is often not at the top of the officials' list of things to attend to. So the question is, are these cases being reported, and then are they being prosecuted? And one thing I believe Georgia has is like a election day hotline type situation where somebody could report if they see something that doesn't look right, or have any problem getting a ballot. So having that kind of resource available helps on both assisting in the moment and also giving some idea of what problems might have ensued. But no, I can't point to any specific examples this year. None have come to my attention.
Representative Turner, you get the honor of the final question.
Thank you. Wouldn't that mean that, so we talk about this, I talk about this in terms of risk. And I think part of the risk for me is the knock on voter confidence. When we hear these stories, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, the honest person takes a picture of it and they post it to social media and they create the doubt in the voter's mind as to whether or not there is confidence in this election. And that's just as dangerous to me as the fraud. So there's that part of it. And we talked about how we mitigate that risk with some of the other steps, like making sure our voter rolls are good and also that we're using exact match signatures. But just because we haven't heard about it doesn't mean it's not happening, right? I mean, they could get away with it and we'd never know. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir, that is. And in fact, there's evidence now that that North Carolina example of collecting ballots in a fraudulent way had been going on in previous years. And it was by using data that got exposed. People could,
Sure.
There was a difference in the number of absentee ballots being cast in these communities as opposed to others that was huge by magnitudes. So some amount of data science type people might be able to help on the big front. But
Sure.
and that's why I said I'm not aware of these situations.
And in the bigger, you know, in the bigger elections, the national elections, the presidential elections, the difference may not matter a whole lot because you might have maybe 1,000 in here or a couple hundred there. But in a smaller area, like I've had school board seats, countywide school board seat selected by 17 votes. That was the margin between the two candidates. I've had a county commission chairman here, which is an extraordinarily powerful position in my county, win by 14 votes. So it doesn't take a lot to change the outcome of an election if somebody has concerted their efforts in a small area and they're actually able to get away with it. So the security measures to make sure that those are continue to be vital because we want to mitigate the risk. We recognize that there is a risk, but we need to mitigate it.
Absolutely. And this is where I said at the beginning, there's no best policy on this. In fact, there's hardly even a list of good options. What we've got is voters who don't want to come to a polling place. And so you meet them where they are as best you can. And the state has to figure out where they are on that teeter-totter with in-person and absentee. And I wish it were easy. If it were easy, we wouldn't be here today. And I know you all have been working hard on this this year. And so I'm sort of sorry I don't have something more positive to offer in terms of how to make sure November goes well.
Well, Ms. Underhill, we really want to thank you. I have a number of members asking if you'd be willing to share those slides. I know we have your report and we have some hard copies here if any of the members present would like to take one with them. But is it possible to get a hold of those slides, Ms. Underhill?
Absolutely. I will send them to Ms. Aziz as soon as we're off the phone. And I do have a few things that I'll follow up on, and I'll share those with her as well. And that can be shared onward when I've got that prepared. That'll include the curbside voting report.
Well, there is a limited amount of time between now and the November elections. So we're not looking to move mountains between now and then, but if there are some suggestions, some small suggestions that may come across that can be entertained, that would help people vote come November, that's what we're looking for. So thank you so very much. I'll let you close us out if you will, Ms. Underhill. Thank everybody for being here. Appreciate the question and the engagement. We may want to revisit this later on when we're looking a little bit bigger, more to the future. At a later date.
I appreciate being invited to be here, and I thank you very much. And I look forward to working with you and your colleagues as the year and perhaps years go by. So we'll be in touch.
Likewise. Thank you. Nothing further. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.